I want to take a minute and talk about a passage of scripture found in the book of Matthew in chapter 14. There's a lot going on in chapter 14, but by the time this happens, his ministry has been moving along, and there was a man by the name of John the Baptist who is described in the Bible as looking kind of like me. He long beard, long hair, maybe not wearing a t-shirt, but more of a rundown cloak. John the Baptist is baptizing people and telling them to repent, to turn from their current way of life and live in the way of this coming Messiah, who we know to be Jesus. And ultimately, his life and his kind of prophetic nature got him killed. He had a knack for speaking truth to power, and John the Baptist had some harsh words for Herod, for the king of the time, about who he could and could not marry. And on one night at a party, someone asked for John the Baptist's head, and it happened. He was beheaded and killed because of what he believed to be the work of Jesus. Now, Jesus is going on with his ministry and knows of John the Baptist, is connected with John the Baptist, loves the work of John the Baptist, considers John the Baptist a co-laborer in the coming of the kingdom. And Jesus hears of John the Baptist being beheaded, being killed, and he's grieved. And in 14, it says that when Jesus heard about John, he withdrew. He withdrew to a deserted place by himself. But by this point, crowds of people had been hearing about Jesus and wanting to experience the freedom in Jesus. Jesus had been healing people and feeding people. And so all of these hungry people, these people with all kinds of needs, couldn't stay away. And they heard about Jesus and they followed him on foot to where he had withdrawn. And so we pick up in 14, and this is a famous story of Jesus feeding 5,000 people. And so when Jesus arrived, he saw a large crowd, and he had compassion for them, and he healed those who were sick. That evening, his disciples came and said to him, "This is an isolated place. It's getting late. Send the crowds away so they can go into the villages and buy food for themselves." But Jesus said to them, "There's no need to send them away. No need to send them away. You give them something to eat." They replied, "We have nothing here except 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish." He said, "Bring them here to me." He ordered the crowds to sit in the grass, and he took the 5 loaves of the bread and the 2 fish, and he looked up to heaven. He blessed them and broke the loaves apart and gave them to his disciples. Then the disciples gave them to the crowds. Everyone ate until they were full, and they filled 12 baskets with the leftovers. About 5,000 men, plus women and children, had eaten. I think as we hear this story, there's a couple thoughts, 3 thoughts that I want us to process. I think in this we get an example of how we are to carry compassion, how we are to care for people, even in a time when we are grieving. COVID-19 is progressively bringing up more and more grief in our life. And maybe it's traditional grief, like you've lost a person or someone you love is sick. But I also think there's grief that happens around security, where we once had this sense of security, whether that could be financial security or security in our health or security in the health and security of our family, the security of our friends. Right now, there's a lot of fear around how COVID-19 might take away some of that security. And to think that we don't need to grieve that security, I think, is a miss. This is going to be a season of grieving all kinds of things. Our security, our health, a sick friend, grieving control. But I think what Jesus shows us in this is that, yes, we need to grieve, right? Jesus pulls away to an isolated place, but grief doesn't have to trump our compassion. Grief doesn't have to trump our active nature in the world. Grief doesn't mean that we need to push people away. This is a complicated time. This is a really hard time, and I think it's going to be tempting to not get involved because my own grief is too large. It's going to be tempting just to stay in bed. It's going to be tempting to go through our day and just really disconnect or unplug or to lose ourselves in social media. And I would just encourage us to grieve well, to acknowledge our grief, but not to allow that grief to keep us from being inactive. See, Jesus, when he sees the crowd, he has compassion on them. And I think Jesus invites us in the midst of our grief, that while we're grieving, not in spite of our grief, but while we're grieving, to still open our eyes and look around. That there are people all around us who need to be seen. And perhaps to allow our heart to yet be broken for the things that breaks God's heart, and allow compassion for others to be a significant part of our journey and a piece of our grief. So I'd encourage you to ask yourself, what are you grieving? What are you grieving right now? Are you afraid of the loss of security? Are you grieving the security of your bank account, or the security of your job that gives you purpose, or the security of your aging parents or grandparents, or maybe the security of your children in this time? What are you grieving? And how might you acknowledge that grief and go through that grief, but not allow that grief to keep you from growing in compassion? I think the second thing that Jesus invites us to look at in the midst of this passage is asking what might be in your hand. See, as the crowds gather and the problem in front of the disciples is keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger, as all of these people are hungry and all of these people have needs. The response of the disciples is to say, send them away. We only have enough food here to take care of us. See, Jesus, there's 12 of us and one of you. That's 13 people that need to eat, 13 people that need to share in this small amount of food that we have. Send the people away so they can go into town and they can get their own food, so they can find somehow to take care of themselves. But I think in the midst of this, Jesus looks at this moment and he rebukes the disciples in this moment, saying, no. That is not how we respond to need in the way of Jesus. This is not a time to take care of your own and to stock up for yourself and to just have everybody be each to their own. But this is a time to acknowledge what might be in your hand. Jesus says, you give them something to eat. You give them something to eat. I want you to consider in this time when maybe you're not sure what to do. Maybe you're not sure how to help. The temptation is to do nothing. But perhaps in this time you could spend some time reflecting on what might be in your hand. What are the assets that you hold? Maybe your income won't be effective at all during this time. And there might be somebody in your life, somebody in your sphere, somebody in your community who's losing the entirety of their income in this time. Perhaps you could be a financial help to somebody else during this time. But maybe it's not money. Maybe it's a smile. Maybe your personality is an asset. Maybe you're somebody who brings joy into other people's lives. I think during the coming weeks and maybe months, hopefully not months, people are going to become more and more isolated from each other. And we have those among us, we have neighbors and friends whose mental health has been a struggle. And perhaps your asset is a phone call. Your asset is a note of encouragement, a text of encouragement, a FaceTime call or a Zoom call, just to connect with somebody and encourage them and remind them that you love them. Perhaps you have a skill that could be offered in this time. Perhaps you have a car and you could drive to pick up groceries or pick up medications for a neighbor. Perhaps you're good at organizing people. Maybe you could organize something just on your street to remind people that life is more than just what we have and don't have, but that you could organize something on your street. We're hearing of all kinds of things in some of the places like Italy where people are stepping out on their sidewalk at 6 p.m. every night and cheering and applauding all the medical workers who are working day in, day night to service this time of COVID-19, or I'm hearing of blocks where people are organizing, putting their Christmas lights back up, just to remind each other that there's life and there's hope and there's a reason to go on. Maybe I've heard of blocks organizing sing-alongs, like stepping out on your curb and singing a song. Maybe you could organize a street happy hour where your neighbors could just step outside on the sidewalk and keeping your 6 feet of distance and just sharing in a drink and looking across to each other and waving to each other. Perhaps you could leave a note for your mailman who shows up every day at your door and continues to work. Perhaps you could leave a thank you note on your garbage can for the garbage people who are coming around and picking up the trash. There's all kinds of things that we could do in this time to continue to lean into love, to continue to push. What is in your hand? What could maybe you can contribute? How could we be creative to continue life in this time? The temptation will be the temptations of the disciples. Say, Jesus, send people away. Send people away to go find what they need. Let's just assume that everybody can take care of themselves. But in the way of Jesus, this is not the way we think. In the way of Jesus, we acknowledge that we're all very interconnected. That your win is my win and your loss is my hungry. That if you're hungry, I'm hungry. If you're lonely, I'm lonely. If you're depressed, I'm depressed. So how might we serve each other? How might we love each other? How might we love those who are in our circle? How might we love those who are in proximity with us? How might we love our neighbors, both the people we know through our social circles, but also our literal neighbors? What does it mean to love them? What assets are in your hand that you could give during this time? And I think the third question that has to be asked is, will you offer it? See, Jesus commands his disciples to recognize what's in their hand, and he commands them then to share it with the crowd, to share it with others. But there is this decision point of like, will you offer it? Will you take these assets and hoard them to yourselves, or will you give them away? Will you share those assets with others? And I think that's a really important question. What will you do with the things that you have in your hand? I think often there's two big things that keep us from sharing with others, and this is what I want to leave you with in this moment, is what are you lacking that keeps you from sharing? Is it courage? Are you afraid to reach out to your neighbor, afraid to put your asset out there? Do you lack the courage that if you give what you have away, then maybe you won't have enough? Or maybe you lack compassion. Maybe you've been so disconnected from needs of others for so long that inside your heart, the reed of compassion, your ability to feel anything for other people, the ability to feel anything for the others, has maybe that light, that ability has gotten dim. And what you lack is compassion. I want to encourage you in this season to check in with your soul, to check in with your inner life, and maybe make that a point of prayer. God, give me the compassionate heart of Jesus, right? Jesus saw the crowds and he had compassion, even though he was grieving the loss of John, even though the pressure around his movement was literally costing people's lives. Jesus had compassion for the crowd. And then maybe you could pray that God would give you courage to let go, courage to put yourself out there, courage to give away what you have without fearing that you might not get it back. Jesus has much to teach us during this time, and I hope that you will continue to consider the way of Jesus. You'll consider during this season how the way of Jesus might help us to find a way to exist in this time. Blessings, and I'm so grateful to be with you on this journey.